So Pamela just reminded you about what we've been doing during Lent as a community, and that's why the sermon topics have been what they've been. So we've been talking about those things we're hoping to focus on a bit more. Life, beauty, God's character, joy. And this week, on the final Sunday of Lent, the topic is love, which makes sense because really it's the love of God that's behind everything else that we've been talking about. Okay, so it's so easy when we talk about love or when we talk about God's love to, in our minds, kind of go all precious moments. So here's a trigger warning. We're not doing that this morning. It seems somehow that the spirit of Lent has taken over me during Lent, so that when I spoke on life, I began by talking about death. And when I spoke on joy, I began by speaking about Brené Brown. And when I'm speaking about love this morning, I'm going to begin by speaking about suffering. And in fact, I'm going to keep on talking about suffering all the way through. So be prepared. And there's a reason for that, and that is this. I believe it is our common experience and really our understanding that love involves suffering. We might not think that right away, but it does. Now, of course, the suffering can be unhealthy. It can be in unhealthy ways, and those are things we need to work to prevent, obviously. But even the best and most healthy love involves suffering. I think we know that and experience that in our most important relationships with family, with spouses and partners, with very close friends. All of those loves, even when healthy, involve suffering. And here's why. Because to love is to be vulnerable. To love truly and deeply, we have to choose to make ourselves truly and deeply vulnerable. And being truly vulnerable means being willing to suffer. That's what it means. This is true for us, and as I believe we see most clearly in Holy Week, astonishingly, this is also true for God, which is what I want to talk about this morning. So here's our agenda. First, I'm going to talk about love and suffering generally. And then I'm going to talk about love and suffering in the context of Holy Week. And when we talk about it generally, we're going to get philosophical, theological, and biblical. So first, getting philosophical. There's been a lot written about love and freedom and what we might call the messiness of this world. Obviously, not everyone has the same take on these big subjects, but let me present you one approach. If there is to be a world with the possibility of genuine love in it, that would also have to be a world that has genuine freedom in it. As an example, if Heidi tells me that she loves me, and sometimes she does, but if Heidi tells me that she loves me, but was forced to say it, that's not what we mean by love. If she was hypnotized, that's not what we mean by love. If she's lying, that's not what we mean. What makes the statement, I love you, special, and what makes a lifelong commitment of love special, is that it's not necessary. It's a choice. Sometimes it's a big choice, like when Jenna and Emily got married yesterday. But also it's a whole series of little choices, like what is in front of them and their newly consecrated family for the rest of their lives. Little choices to prioritize the flourishing of the other. Choices to be present. To rejoice when the other rejoices. To mourn when the other mourns. To choose it even when it involves inconvenience and pain and suffering. That is love. It requires choice, which requires freedom. But here's the thing about freedom. In a world with genuine freedom, there's going to be mess. Because when everyone is free, there are going to be moments when decisions lead to struggle and conflict and just the general messiness that we experience that leads to different kinds of suffering. So according to this philosophical view, a world with love in it will necessarily be a world with suffering in it to various degrees. There's no avoiding it. And now let's get theological. When it comes to Holy Week, when it comes to the suffering and death of Jesus, some theologians have had similar thoughts about love and freedom and suffering. These theologians see the cross as a necessary part of creation and love. I'll explain that in just a minute, but first, I want to say that all too often, in my opinion, just my opinion, when we hear theology about the cross, it is so often framed as a necessary punishment that someone had to bear to pay the price for our sins. Substitutionary atonement, it's often called, and the idea is this: we sinned, so there had to be violent punishment. And God decided to take that on so that we don't have to. This is a vision many of us grew up with, where a beautiful and perfect world got ruined by our sin, and then a violent God demanded a victim. Now, there's no doubt that Paul sometimes framed thinking about Christ this way when speaking to Jews who were in the context of sacrifices in a temple. But there is another way that theologians have to frame the cross and the meaning of the cross. And I'm not offering it as a throw that other away. I'm offering it as something else to think about alongside, if you wish. Rather than seeing the cross as something like a spare tire on a world that threw a flat, some theologians see the creation of the world and the cross as two sides of the same coin. In other words, the cross isn't a spare tire. It isn't a plan B. It was part of the deal if there was going to be a loving world at all. Because, as we've just heard, love necessarily involves suffering. So God isn't going to just stand by and watch all of us suffer alone in the world that God made to have love in it, where we end up the victims. No, God is going to join creation, join the suffering. That's the significance of Emmanuel, as we say at Christmas time, God with us, suffering with us. I can't just push a magic button and make suffering go away, says God, or else love will disappear from the world. And for me, love is a non-negotiable. So I'll join you. I'll suffer alongside you. Creation and the cross is two sides of the same coin, and that coin is given a name in this theological approach, and it is called kenosis, which it's a Greek word that refers to the self-emptying love of God, which they see, these theologians, as being present in both creation and the cross. Kenosis, self-emptying love. Let me give you an example. When God creates a world with genuine freedom in it, there is a sense in which God is emptied of some power. Because now God has left room for others to think and choose and act freely. And on the cross, of course, we see the most powerful symbol we can of the self-emptying love of God, a love that goes as deep as any love can. Okay, that's theology. Now let's get biblical for a little bit. And what I want to do is try to show you that this idea that even God experiences love and suffering together, I want to show you that this idea is found throughout the Bible. This is not just some guy standing behind a pulpit making stuff up, although it may be an element. But here are things that are found in the Bible. And I'll start in early Genesis at the famous flood story. At the beginning of that story, when God sees all the violence that human beings have brought into the world, I want to remind you that we do not read that God is angry, as we so often think about it. We read that God is grieved, that God is saddened, that in God's heart there is pain. And the Hebrew word used to describe God's pain at the beginning of the flood story is the same Hebrew word used to describe the pain a woman experiences in labor. God with us, even in our pain. And by the end of that flood story, of course, the human beings have not changed. Their hearts are still just problematic. But God's heart has changed. That's weird for us to think about, that the only character development in the flood story is in God. For now, God withdraws the lawsuit against humanity while renewing and increasing the commitment and the blessing. Love that includes suffering, experienced by God in the flood story, who is willing to be vulnerable and to suffer, all for the sake of love. It's all right there, right in the flood story, that heart of God that hurts and loves. Then we can move forward in Genesis to the covenant that God makes with Abraham. And as I mentioned a few months ago, God invites Abraham to cut some large animals in half and arrange the halves in such a way that there would be space between them and would create a pathway of blood. Sounds a little gross, but this was typical in the ancient Near East, where the phrase establishing a covenant is actually literally cutting a covenant. That's the phrase in the ancient Near East. You cut a covenant. Sometimes we still say that we cut a deal, and some people wonder if that traces itself all the way back to the ancient Near East. But it's called cutting a covenant because of the animals and their broken bodies and the blood. Anyway, typically, both parties, or representatives from both parties, would walk the blood path between the animal halves, and that would signify the intensity of this covenant and the serious results if the covenant is broken. The idea was this: may the same thing happen to me if I break this covenant. May I too be ripped apart. But shockingly, when God cuts the covenant with Abraham, signifying God's long-term commitment to both Abraham and Sarah and their descendants, only God walks through the blood path. Read it. Abraham falls into a trance and a flaming fire pot goes through only, not Abraham. Meaning, only God will suffer in the deepest possible way when the covenant is broken. It's not fair. In other words, yet again, we see a commitment, a love that is costly for God, more costly for God, and that involves suffering. I'm wondering if this sounds anything like Holy Week yet to you. And then, of course, with Moses and the Israelites, as they make their way from Egypt to the Promised Land, God experiences lots of frustration in this relationship. Moses wants to be a hero right up to the moment that he doesn't want to. And God accurately calls the Israelites a stubborn and stiff-necked people. But God doesn't give up. And centuries later, God sends wave after wave of prophets to help guide those wayward Israelites back to the covenant. And those prophets pass along messages from God that sound like this: return, faithless people, for I am your husband. Or like this: how gladly would I treat you like my children. Or this: I will betroth you to me forever with love and compassion. Only return. Over and over and over in the work of the prophets, we hear both the tender love of God and the hurt that comes from being vulnerable. All in God. And Jesus talks this way too as he looks toward Jerusalem not long before his so-called triumphal entry. Jerusalem, oh Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you, how often have I longed to gather your children together like a hen gathers her chicks under her wings. But you were not willing. Love that involves suffering, even for God. It's a biblical theme that's right there and carries all the way through from early Genesis all the way through to the New Testament letters, as we'll see. So there are some thoughts generally about love and suffering, even for God. Now I want to talk about Holy Week. And we'll start with Jesus feeling the suffering that comes with love, as we just heard in that image with the mother hen and the baby chicks, a female image of God, by the way. But despite the suffering, Jesus kept loving. He loved the hapless, confused disciples. He loved the woman caught in adultery, the outcast Samaritan woman at the well. He loved the sick and the lame, the marginalized and the outcasts. And in doing so, Jesus exposed the hypocrisy of the religious elite who had been using religious power to raise themselves up and keep others down. They did not like having their hypocrisy exposed, their power threatened, so they looked for a way to destroy Jesus, and they found it. And those are the events of Holy Week. Let's look at those events through the lens of love and suffering. Holy Week begins as we just began it, with the triumphal entry. Palm Sunday, we call it. I think every church I've ever gone to has celebrated or observed Palm Sunday in a way that is embarrassing and ridiculous and absurd and silly and awkward. I've been to churches where the kids are given the branches and they're told to walk around waving them, and they have looks on their faces like, we just landed in a Shakespeare play and we don't know the rules. Other times, the grown-ups are waving them as the kids are walking through a tunnel. Why? I've been to churches where the entire congregation leaves the church and marches around the block, singing. I was once preaching in a service like that, and there I was at the front wearing a robe. People playing tennis just stopping. I just felt like, I don't know, getting out a conga and just chanting and saying, join us, and we can be one. There's no good way to celebrate Palm Sunday. And I think that's appropriate, because the original triumphal entry was all of those things: embarrassing, silly, awkward, wrong. Imagine how that felt for Jesus. Jesus loved all these people. The disciples, the other followers, the people who to him felt like sheep without a shepherd, the lost. Jesus loved them. And they thought they loved him. But they were in this relationship for all the wrong reasons. They didn't understand him. And being misunderstood is a kind of loneliness, as I'm sure you know. So we celebrate it knowing that these people are cheering for all the wrong reasons. They're not going to get what they're expecting. Yes, there will be a king and a kingdom, and as Sarah said in her prayer, but it's not going to be what they were cheering for. And after that, Jesus spent time in the temple for the first part of the week, teaching, telling parables, answering trick questions, turning over tables, church stuff. And then there's the Last Supper on Thursday, a Passover meal. And that meal, as we read, begins with another really awkward moment. Jesus washing the disciples' feet. He's not supposed to do that. Leaders are not supposed to do that. People high up in a hierarchy are not supposed to wash the feet of people lower down in a hierarchy. That's dirty work. When Jesus was challenged about his inappropriate behavior, he basically said, this is what love requires in the kingdom of God. Emptying yourself of status and power. And after the meal, Jesus says, there's no greater love than this, to be willing to die for the sake of your friends. You are my friends. I think we'd all like to think that if we were there, we'd make the connection. And then Jesus says this, love each other as I have loved you. There it is. They don't get it, but there it is, right in the middle of Holy Week, a mini lecture from Jesus about how the deepest love involves suffering. And things just get worse from there. The disciples can't stay awake to keep Jesus company while he's troubled and praying. And so in a sense, even though they're physically around, Jesus is alone. They won't mourn with those who mourn. They just sleep. Jesus experiences the pain of betrayal by a disciple, and I think we forget that the disciples were Jesus' closest friends, most trusted friends. At the arrest of Jesus, Peter goes all violent, chops off some guy's ear. Jesus puts it back on, says, none of that, please. And very soon after that, the disciples all desert Jesus and run away. And from here on out, at least when it comes to his friends, Jesus is truly alone. Peter denies knowing Jesus even a little. It's not like, well, I might have seen him once. No. 3 times Peter does this publicly, as you know. All 4 Gospels describe these denials, but only Luke describes something else right after the 3rd denial, that Jesus turns and looks right at Peter. And I want you to imagine the suffering that must have been in that look. Betrayal, loneliness, denial. Love leaves us vulnerable, and deep love leaves us vulnerable to a lot. That's true in this moment, even for Jesus, as he looks right at Peter. And then, of course, after the questioning, after the power plays by both the religious and the Roman authorities, Jesus is left on the cross to die. But even then, even during that suffering on the cross, Jesus shows love. He quotes a psalm so that his followers could figure things out later. And that's what's going on when Jesus calls out, my God, why have you forsaken me? That's the first line of a Jewish hymn. Psalm 22. I encourage you to read it and see what Jesus was teaching, even while he was dying, still teaching, which, if done right, is a kind of loving. From the cross, Jesus arranges for his mother to have a protector after he's gone, and for the disciple John to have a purpose. Jesus forgives those who did this to him because they didn't know what they were doing. And then he dies. In all of this, we see, in the most powerful way possible, right into the heart of God. This, I believe, is the main point of the cross. However else we think about it and whatever other theological systems we put on it. This is the point of the cross. Not some sort of system of violent punishment. The point is we get to see right through to the true nature of God's love for us. And what is that? Let's talk about what is not. It's not superficial. It's not convenient. It's not that leftover kind of love that we all know about. It's the kind of love that when we have the time and the energy, that optional love we have for things that don't really matter to us. It's not any of those things. God's love for us is the deepest possible kind of self-emptying love. The kind that leaves the lover vulnerable, the kind where the lover will suffer. We know what that kind of love is like a little. We have glimpses in the relationships I mentioned at the beginning. But astonishingly, as we see in Holy Week, God knows what that kind of love is like a lot. So that's my main point. You can stop listening now. But I have a postlude. Read, something Paul just couldn't let go of while editing. And it has something to do with Palm Sunday, so it's relevant. I'm just working to justify it. Here it is. But don't lose the main point. God knows love and suffering go together. All through the events of Holy Week, we see Jesus demonstrating love that involves suffering. Just went through it. We see Jesus explaining this love, calling for this love, and we see the disciples just not ever getting it. And we know this, astonishingly, because the disciples themselves preserved their own pathetic stories. And eventually those stories were written down in these Gospels. They preserved for us the fact that the disciples didn't get it, that they did not understand that love and suffering go together even for God. But here's what's interesting to me. We actually know that the church did understand the connection between love and suffering even for God early on, well before any of our four Gospels were written. Just pretend you're interested. In Paul's letter to the Philippians, written before any of our four Gospels were written, Paul quotes lyrics from what scholars believe was already at that time a well-known Christian hymn. Paul is trying to encourage the Philippians to have the same love for each other that Jesus has for us. Be like Jesus, says Paul, and then he quotes lyrics. Who, being in very nature God, sing along with me if you want, did not consider equality with God something to be held on to, but rather Jesus made himself nothing. The Greek says emptied himself by taking on the very nature of a servant. And being found as a human being, Jesus humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. I just want to say that that is a very sort of brash description of the self-emptying love of God that involves suffering. And that idea was already being sung by Christian congregations well before our four Gospels were written down. And in what we call Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, which was also written before the four Gospels, we read a description of communion and what it's about. The Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood." Now, we've heard these words so many times that sometimes we stop hearing them. So I just want to interrupt and say to you, alarm bells ought to be at least kind of going off for you. Because we just talked about the blood path way back with Abraham, where there were broken bodies of animals. This is how you establish covenants. This is how you cut covenants, with broken bodies. Remember how only God went through, not Abraham. How only God was committed to suffering deeply. And here is Jesus at one and the same time, fulfilling the old covenant and cutting a new covenant with his broken body, not the animals, and with his blood, not the animals. And while that violent imagery kind of bothers us, modern people, our job here is to engage with the ancient literature on its terms, not ours, and to remember what this communicated to that honestly, more brutal ancient world. And the message was this: this is how deep the love of God goes. God cuts a new covenant with Jesus' broken body and blood and fulfills the old one. And then Paul adds this: For whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. I've always found that a bit of a shocking sentence. Why proclaim the Lord's death? When Paul wrote this, everyone knew about the resurrection. Everyone knew about the ascension. Everyone had plenty of reason to do the equivalent of waving palm branches and shouting like conquerors. You know, the rah-rah North American style of Christianity. We win! So why proclaim the Lord's death with communion? And it's because, as the church already knew before the Gospels were written down, it's the suffering of Jesus. The betrayal, the brokenness, the loneliness, the death. Those are the things that show us, really, how deep this love goes. Just how truly with us God with us is. The early church recognized all of this before the Gospels were written. That's my point. But they left us the Gospels anyway, in which the disciples just don't get it. And I find that encouraging and so honest. It's just raw and honest. God's love for us is the deepest possible kind. That's the point of Holy Week. But it is still so easy for us to miss it, or forget it, or choose to misinterpret it because we'd much rather be waving palm branches and shouting and feeling like conquerors. So yet again, this is why we gather here week after week, to be reminded. And this is why so many churches have extra services during Holy Week, to be reminded. There is no greater love than the love God has for us. The most powerful love always includes vulnerability, always includes suffering. That's true for us, and astonishingly, that's true for God. That's what makes this week so important. That's why this week is so central to the Christian understanding of God. Love and vulnerability and suffering, even for God. May we understand this year a little bit more just how deeply we are loved. May we reflect this year that love to others just a little bit more. Amen.